May it please the court? Ladies and gentlemen, the facts in this case aren't complicated, and most of them aren't even in dispute. Sarah Lazar was killed on Valentine's Day 2015 while she was spending time with her husband in the clothing store that they owned. As a result of Mrs. Lazar's death, this defendant, Johnny Hudson, is charged with felony murder in the first degree and armed robbery with a firearm. Attempted armed robbery with a firearm. The issue in this case is not whether these crimes occurred. The issue is who did it. Now, the judge instructed you on what the state must prove for each of the counts in order for you to find the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And the judge has also given you instructions on weighing the evidence presented in this case. Specifically, the judge instructed you to use your common sense in deciding which evidence is the best evidence. Because the issue in this case is identification, the state is going to explain why, based on all of the evidence presented in this case, your common sense will lead you to conclude that identification really is not an issue at all. In the judge's discussion regarding eyewitness testimony, she gave you some factors that you should consider in determining how much weight to give the eyewitness testimony you've heard about how the defendant was identified. There are 9 of them listed in your jury instructions, and I'm going to take a minute to go through each one of them. Number 1, the capacity and opportunity of the eyewitness to observe the offender based upon the length of time for observation and the conditions at the time of observation, including lighting and distance. Ladies and gentlemen, the defendant entered Lazar's clothing store in the middle of the day at about 3:15 in the afternoon. And Mr. Lazar was face to face with a man who pulled a gun on him and his wife and shot his wife in the head. The state submits that you should weigh this factor heavily. Number 2, whether the identification was the product of the eyewitness's own recollection or was the result of influence or suggestiveness. Mr. Lazar first picked this defendant out of a stack of about 50 random pictures. Then, later that same night, both Mr. Lazar and Mr. Green identified the defendant when he was presented in an in-person lineup. Another factor that should be given heavy weight. Number 3, the circumstances under which the defendant was presented to the eyewitness for identification. Ladies and gentlemen, there wasn't some show up where the defendant was brought to the crime scene by the police as the only potential suspect, and Mr. Lazar was tasked with simply confirming the identity of the suspect the police had selected. In fact, the opposite occurred. Again, the defendant was initially presented among a stack of 50 random pictures, and Mr. Lazar identified Johnny Hudson without any influence, outside influence, or information. Heavy weight. Number 4, any inconsistent identifications made by the eyewitnesses. Mr. Lazar's identifications of the suspect were totally consistent. He first picked the defendant out from the stack of random pictures, and he picked him out again the same night during the in-person lineup. And Mr. Lazar's identification was corroborated by Mr. Green, who also identified the defendant as the person who dashed past him and sped away driving a large black sedan. Heavy weight. Number 5, any instance in which the eyewitness did not make an identification when given the opportunity to do so. Didn't happen. On Mr. Lazar's first opportunity to identify his wife's killer, he selected this defendant from a stack of random pictures, but he wanted to be sure. So after the defendant was arrested, he was placed in an in-person lineup with 4 other men. And once again, Mr. Lazar identified Johnny Hudson as the person who killed his wife. Heavy weight. Number 6, the witness's familiarity with the subject identified. Mr. Lazar had no clue who Johnny Hudson was. All he knew is that the person who he identified from the stack of pictures looked like the person who put a bullet in his wife's head. heavy weight. Number 7, lapses of time between the event and the identifications. Mr. Lazar first identified the defendant within a couple of hours of witnessing him shoot his wife in the head, and again just a few hours later during the in-person lineup. Very little lapse of time, heavy weight. Number 8, whether the eyewitness and the offender are of different races or ethnic groups, and whether this may have affected the accuracy of the identification. Mr. Lazar and the defendant are both Caucasian, so race was not an issue. And finally, number 9, the totality of circumstances surrounding the eyewitness's identification. Based on all of the factors the state has presented, the state submits that the eyewitness identification in this case should be given heavy weight. In fact, the identification should be weighed so heavily that the eyewitness testimony is simply overwhelming. Ladies and gentlemen, the state asks that you use your common sense in this case, as the judge's instructions require. Common sense tells you that the man who went into Lazar's clothing store to rob it and shot Sarah Lazar in the head after his partner instructed him to shut her up, Johnny, is this defendant, Johnny Hudson. Common sense tells you that people generally respond when their name is called, and that's what this defendant, Johnny Hudson, did. Common sense also causes you to ask yourself some questions, like, what are the chances that two men who Mr. Lazar had never seen before, but picked out of a stack of about 50 pictures as the assailants who tried to rob his store and ended up killing his wife, happened to be roommates? Common sense causes you to ask yourself, can it really be merely coincidental that when the defendant was arrested in his apartment the same night of the murder, the police recovered a recently cleaned .38 caliber handgun from the nightstand in the defendant's bedroom, the only weapon recovered from the apartment, and the same type of weapon that was used to kill Sarah Lazar just hours earlier? And common sense causes you to ask yourself, was it also just coincidence that the police found out that same night that Johnny Hudson owns a black Cadillac, the same type of car that Mr. Green described as the assailant's getaway car? And the state submits that the answer that common sense will lead you to is that the chance of all of these facts being purely coincidental is highly unlikely. So, ladies and gentlemen, the state asks you to weigh all of the evidence taken together, both the direct evidence as well as all of the circumstantial evidence, which, by the way, carries the exact same weight as direct evidence. And the state submits that after weighing all of the evidence, you will reach the only possible conclusion that your common sense tells you to reach. And that is that this case is really not a case of whodunit at all. And you will find that the state has proven each and every element the state is required to prove, beyond and to the exclusion of all reasonable doubt. And you will therefore find that this defendant, Johnny Hudson, is guilty of felony murder in the first degree and attempted robbery with a firearm. Thank you.